Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Evening. Michael Weston adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, watching his reflection with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 15 years in corporate security. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen enough corporate espionage, fraud investigations, and boardroom battles to handle whatever life threw at him. His dark hair showed touches of silver at the temples, a testament to the stress of protecting multi-million-dollar companies from threats both internal and external. "You look handsome, Daddy," 6-year-old Emma chirped from the top of the stairs, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she skipped down. She was the spitting image of her mother, Virginia, with bright blue eyes that seemed to see everything. "Thank you, Princess." Michael scooped her up, spinning her around until she giggled. "Are you excited to meet your new cousin?" Virginia emerged from the kitchen, smoothing her black dress. Even after 8 years of marriage, she still took his breath away. Marlene sounded exhausted on the phone. "I'm glad we can help with baby Sophia tonight." The plan was simple. Marlene and Barry Fulton needed a night out after 3 weeks of sleepless nights with their newborn. Michael and Virginia would babysit while Barry took Marlene to dinner, their first date since Sophia's birth. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for Emma to bond with her new cousin and for the family to help out. Barry arrived at 7 sharp, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. As Marlene's husband of 5 years, he'd always struck Michael as trying too hard. Expensive suits, flashy watch, the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Tonight, he looked genuinely frazzled. "Thank God you guys could do this," Barry said, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. It's been really hard on her. The baby blues, you know? She needs this." Marlene appeared in the doorway, holding 3-week-old Sophia. She looked pale and thin, shadows under her eyes that spoke of more than just new mother exhaustion. Michael's protective instincts, honed by years of threat assessment, prickled slightly. "Are you sure you're okay, Marlene?" Virginia asked, embracing her sister. "You look just tired." Marlene cut her off, forcing a smile. "Really, this will be good for us." Baby Sophia was perfect. Tiny features, wisps of dark hair, and the peaceful expression that only sleeping newborns possessed. Emma was immediately enchanted, following Virginia and Marlene around as they went over feeding schedules and emergency contacts. "She usually sleeps for about 3 hours after a feeding," Marlene explained, her voice tight with nervous energy. "If she cries, sometimes you have to be firm with her. She can be difficult." Michael frowned. Something about the way Marlene said firm didn't sit right with him, but Virginia was already nodding and asking about formula temperatures. After Barry and Marlene left, the evening settled into a comfortable rhythm. Virginia prepared bottles while Michael helped Emma with her homework at the kitchen table. The house felt warm and peaceful, filled with the ordinary sounds of family life. Around 9 o'clock, Sophia began to fuss. Virginia was in the shower, so Michael went to check on the baby while Emma finished coloring a picture of the coffee table. "Can I help, Daddy?" Emma asked, following him to the nursery Marlene had set up in the guest room. "Of course, sweetheart. You can be my assistant." Sophia's cries were getting louder, and Michael could see she needed a diaper change. As he laid her on the changing table, Emma climbed onto a chair beside him, eager to help. "I know how to do this," Emma announced proudly. "Mommy taught me with my dolls." Michael smiled, letting Emma hand him supplies while he worked. But as he opened the soiled diaper, Emma's expression changed from excitement to confusion. "Dad, look at this." Emma's voice was sharp with concern. Michael looked down and felt his blood run cold. Across Sophia's tiny body were marks, small, round burns in various stages of healing. Some were fresh, angry red. Others were older, scarred. The pattern was unmistakable, cigarette burns. For a moment, Michael couldn't breathe. His mind, trained to assess and categorize threats, began cataloging what he was seeing. The burns were deliberately placed, too numerous to be accidental. This wasn't an accident or neglect. This was systematic abuse of a 3-week-old baby. "Daddy, Emma's voice seemed to come from far away. What's wrong with baby Sophia? Michael's hands trembled as he gently covered Sophia with a clean diaper, his mind racing. His first instinct was to scoop up the baby and never let her go back to that house. His second was to find Barry Fulton and make him pay for what he'd done. Virginia appeared in the doorway, her hair still damp from the shower. "How's our little angel?" She stopped mid-sentence, seeing Michael's face. "What's wrong?" Michael moved Emma away from the changing table, his voice carefully controlled. "Emma, sweetheart, can you go finish your picture? Mommy and I need to talk about grown-up things." "But what about baby Sophia's owies?" Michael's heart clenched. Even at 6, Emma recognized that something was terribly wrong. "We're going to help her, princess. I promise." After Emma reluctantly left the room, Michael showed Virginia what he discovered. Her face went white, then red with fury. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands shaking as she moved to examine Sophia more closely. "Michael, this is torture. She's just a baby." "I know." Michael was already pulling out his phone. "We're calling 911. Now." Virginia's hands trembled as she dialed, her voice cracking as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher. Michael stood guard over Sophia, his mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had served him well in corporate investigations. But this wasn't corporate fraud or industrial espionage. This was his family, his niece, and someone was going to pay. As they waited for the police and paramedics to arrive, Michael made a silent promise to the sleeping baby in his arms. He would find out who did this. He would make sure they never hurt her again, and he would ensure they faced justice, whatever form that justice might take. The evening that had started so perfectly was about to become the beginning of something much darker. But Michael Weston had spent his career uncovering the truth and protecting the innocent. He wasn't about to stop now. Chapter 2. Unraveling Threads. The police arrived within minutes, followed closely by paramedics and a representative from Child Protective Services. Michael watched from the living room as they photographed Sophia's injuries, each flash of the camera burning the evidence deeper into his memory. Emma had been moved to the upstairs bedroom with strict instructions to stay put, but he could hear her footsteps pacing above them. Detective Ron Carter was a weathered man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes that had clearly seen too much. He took detailed notes as Michael and Virginia recounted the evening's events, his expression growing darker with each detail. "You said the parents are out to dinner?" Carter asked, closing his notebook. "Barry and Marlene Fulton," Virginia replied, her voice hollow. "They should be back around 11. We'll need to speak with them immediately. In the meantime, the baby will be taken to the hospital for a full examination and then into protective custody." Michael felt Virginia's hand grip his arm as they wheeled Sophia away in a tiny ambulance. The house suddenly felt empty and wrong. After the officials left, Michael and Virginia sat in stunned silence. Emma had finally fallen asleep upstairs, exhausted by the emotional weight of the evening, even though she didn't fully understand what had happened. "I should have seen something," Virginia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Marlene's my sister. How could I not know?" Michael pulled her close, his mind already working through the timeline. "You couldn't have known. These injuries, some of them are weeks old. This started before we even knew Sophia existed." That thought brought another wave of fury. Marlene had been hiding this, bringing her baby around family, while someone was systematically torturing her. But who? And why was Marlene allowing it to happen? Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Barry, running late. "Don't wait up. Thanks again for watching Sophia." The casual tone made Michael's stomach turn. He showed Virginia the message. "Should we tell him what happened?" Virginia asked. "No, not yet." Michael's security training kicked in. "We don't know who's responsible. If Barry's involved, warning him gives him time to destroy evidence or run. If he's not involved, he deserves to hear this from the police, not a text message." Virginia nodded, understanding the logic even through her grief. "What do we do now?" "Now we wait. And I make some calls." Michael's 15 years in corporate security had connected him with law enforcement professionals across the state. More importantly, he learned how to investigate, how to gather evidence, and how to build cases that would hold up in court. If the police investigation moved too slowly, or if legal loopholes threatened justice for Sophia, Michael was prepared to take matters into his own hands. He started with a call to Lewis Klein, a private investigator who'd helped him with several corporate cases. Lewis was good at finding information that others missed, and he wasn't particular about office hours. Michael, it's past midnight. This better be important. It is. I need you to run deep background checks on Barry Fulton and anyone connected to him. Employment history, criminal record, financial situation, associates, everything. This related to that corporate case you were working on? No, this is personal. And Lewis? I need this fast. Give me 48 hours. Next, Michael called Clark Richardson, a former FBI agent who now worked in private security. Clark had helped him expose a money laundering scheme 2 years ago, and Michael trusted his judgment. Clark, I need advice on a child abuse case. Specifically, what happens if the legal system moves too slowly or doesn't deliver justice? There was a long pause. Michael, whatever you're thinking, don't. Let the system work. The system fails sometimes. You know that better than anyone. Yeah, it does. But vigilante justice creates more problems than it solves. What's going on? Michael filled him in on the evening's events. Clark listened without interrupting, his silence speaking volumes. Jesus, Michael. I'm sorry. That's horrific. But you need to let the police handle this. If you interfere with their investigation or take matters into your own hands, you could compromise their case. And if their case falls apart, if whoever did this walks free, then we cross that bridge when we come to it. But right now, you need to trust the system. Your niece needs you to be smart about this, not emotional. After ending the call, Michael sat in his home office, staring at photos of Emma and Virginia on his desk. Beside them was a picture from Sophia's birth. Marlene holding her daughter with Barry, standing proudly behind them. Looking at Barry's smile, now, made Michael's skin crawl. He opened his laptop and began his own investigation. Corporate security had taught him that financial records often told stories that people try to hide. He started with public records, property ownership, tax liens, bankruptcy filings, anything that might reveal stress or motive. What he found was interesting. Barry Fulton worked as a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, pulling in a decent salary. But there were warning signs. A foreclosure notice from 2 years ago, multiple late payments on credit cards, and a recent garnishment of wages for unpaid child support from a previous relationship. Child support. Michael's blood ran cold. Barry had another child from before his marriage to Marlene, a child Michael and Virginia had never heard about. He dug deeper, finding the court records. Barry had a 7-year-old son named Trevor from his first marriage. The custody arrangement was limited, supervised visitations only, with a note in the file about concerns regarding the minor's safety. Michael leaned back in his chair, pieces clicking into place. Barry had a history of concerning behavior with children, enough to warrant supervised visitation with his own son. And now Sophia was being abused. But the burns were methodical, calculated. They spoke of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain, someone who took time to plan each injury. That level of deliberate cruelty suggested something darker than just an overwhelmed new father. Michael's phone buzzed with another message, this time from Marlene. Hope Sophia was good for you. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow. As if nothing had happened. As if her daughter wasn't lying in a hospital bed with evidence of systematic torture covering her tiny body. The front door opened downstairs. Virginia was still awake, and Michael heard her quiet conversation with someone, probably Detective Carter returning with questions. Michael saved his research and headed downstairs. It was time to see how Barry and Marlene reacted to the news that their secret was out. Their reactions would tell him everything he needed to know about who was responsible. And then the real work would begin. Chapter 3. The Masks Fall. Detective Carter stood in the living room with Barry and Marlene, who had clearly been pulled from their dinner. Marlene's face was streaked with tears, while Barry paced near the window, his earlier disheveled appearance now transformed into barely controlled agitation. This is insane, Barry was saying as Michael entered the room. You're telling me that our baby was hurt while we were gone? How is that possible? Michael studied Barry's body language. The gestures were too big, too performed. In corporate investigations, Michael had learned to spot deception, and Barry was practically screaming lies with every movement. Mr. Fulton, Detective Carter said patiently, the injuries we documented tonight are not recent. Some of these burns are several weeks old. They occurred before tonight. Marlene looked up from her hands, her face a mask of confusion. That's impossible. I would have noticed. Would you? Virginia interrupted, her voice sharp with hurt and anger. Marlene, some of these burns are on her back, places you'd see every time you change her diaper. How could you not notice? The room fell silent, except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Michael watched Marlene's face closely, seeing something flicker behind her eyes. Not confusion, but calculation. I don't know, Marlene whispered. Maybe I did see something, but I thought it was diaper rash, or maybe she was allergic to something. Marlene. Michael's voice was quiet, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to extracting truth. Cigarette burns don't look like diaper rash. You knew. Barry stopped pacing. Are you accusing my wife of? I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Michael replied evenly. I'm asking questions that need answers. For instance, Barry, do you smoke? Sometimes. So what? What brand? Detective Carter perked up, understanding where Michael was heading. Mr. Fulton, we'll need to test any cigarettes found in your home against the burn patterns. This is ridiculous, Barry snapped. Why would I hurt my own daughter? I love that baby. The same way you love Trevor? Michael asked quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Barry's face went white, then flushed red. How do you know about Trevor? I make it my business to know about threats to my family, Michael replied. Supervised visitation only, with concerns about the minor's safety. That's quite a red flag. Virginia looked between her husband and her brother-in-law. Who's Trevor? My son from my first marriage, Barry said through gritted teeth. And that was all a misunderstanding. My ex-wife was vindictive. Vindictive enough to convince a family court judge that you were a danger to your own child. Michael pressed. That takes evidence, Barry. What kind of evidence? Detective Carter stepped forward. Mr. Weston, I appreciate your concern, but I'll handle the questioning. Michael nodded, but didn't step back. He'd gotten what he needed. Confirmation that Barry had a history of concerning behavior with children, and that both Barry and Marlene were lying about the extent of their knowledge. Mrs. Fulton, Carter continued, I need you to think very carefully. Have you ever left Sophia alone with anyone? Babysitters, relatives, friends? Marlene shook her head. No, never. Only Barry and me. And you've never noticed these injuries before tonight? I know. I mean, maybe I saw some redness, but babies get rashes. Michael had heard enough. The pieces were forming a picture, but it wasn't complete. Marlene was definitely hiding something, but her demeanor suggested fear more than guilt. Barry, on the other hand, was displaying classic signs of a person under pressure who was used to talking his way out of trouble. Detective Carter, Michael said, I'd like to request that both Barry and Marlene submit to polygraph tests. That's not up to you, Barry snapped. No, it's not, but it's a reasonable request given the circumstances. Michael turned to Marlene. Unless you have something to hide. Marlene's eyes darted to Barry, and in that moment, Michael saw the truth. She was terrified, not of the police, not of the investigation, but of Barry. I want to help, Marlene said quietly. Whatever you need me to do. Marlene, shut up, Barry warned. Don't say anything without a lawyer. Why would she need a lawyer if she's innocent? Virginia asked, stepping closer to her sister. Marlene, what aren't you telling us? The mask finally cracked. Marlene's composure broke, and she began sobbing. Not the quiet tears of grief, but the desperate sobs of someone who'd been carrying a terrible secret. I couldn't stop him, she whispered. I tried, but he said he'd leave me with nothing. He said no one would believe me. He said, Marlene, stop talking. Barry's voice was harsh now, any pretense of the concerned father evaporating. But it was too late. Detective Carter stepped between Barry and Marlene, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Ma'am, are you saying that Mr. Fulton is responsible for your daughter's injuries? Marlene nodded through her tears. He said it was discipline. He said babies needed to learn early, or they'd be spoiled. But she's just a baby. She doesn't understand. Barry lunged toward Marlene, but Michael was faster. 15 years of corporate security had kept him in excellent shape, and his reflexes were sharp. He caught Barry's arm and twisted it behind his back, slamming him against the wall. "Don't even think about it," Michael growled in Barry's ear. Detective Carter quickly cuffed Barry while he cursed and struggled. "Barry Fulton, you're under arrest for aggravated child abuse. You have the right to remain silent." As Carter read Barry his rights, Michael held Virginia while she comforted her sobbing sister. The truth was out, but Michael knew this was just the beginning. Barry would hire lawyers, claim innocence, maybe even try to blame Marlene. The legal system would grind slowly forward, and there was no guarantee of justice. But Michael wasn't planning to rely solely on the legal system. He'd been building cases for 15 years, and he knew how to ensure that justice was served, one way or another. As the police led Barry away, he turned back toward the house. "This isn't over, Weston. You have no idea what you're getting into." Michael met his gaze steadily. "Actually, Barry, I think you're the one who doesn't know what he's gotten into." The threat was clear, and Michael felt no fear. He'd spent his career taking down people who thought they were untouchable. Barry Fulton was about to learn that some fights weren't worth picking. But first, Michael had a case to build, evidence to gather, and a plan to formulate. Justice for Sophia was just beginning. Chapter 4, Building the Case. 3 days after Barry's arrest, Michael sat in his home office, surrounded by files, photographs, and legal documents. The official investigation was proceeding, but slowly. Barry had posted bail, $50,000 paid by his parents, and was back on the streets with a restraining order keeping him away from Sophia and Marlene. Michael knew that restraining orders were just pieces of paper to men like Barry Fulton. Lewis Klein's background report had arrived that morning, and it painted a disturbing picture. Barry's first marriage had ended after his wife, Jennifer, filed multiple domestic violence reports. The supervised visitation with Trevor wasn't just about child safety concerns. It was because Trevor had been hospitalized twice with suspicious injuries that couldn't be definitively proven as abuse. Jennifer had moved across the country after their divorce, changing her and Trevor's last names. She'd been running from Barry for 7 years. Michael picked up his phone and dialed the number Lewis had provided. "Jennifer Martinez?" The voice was cautious, guarded. "Ms. Martinez, my name is Michael Weston. I'm calling about Barry Fulton." Silence. "Then I don't talk about Barry." "I can't. Ma'am, Barry is married to my sister-in-law. He's been arrested for child abuse. I think you and I should talk." Another long pause. He heard another child, a baby, a 3-week-old baby. "Oh God." Jennifer's voice broke. "I was afraid this would happen. I tried to warn people, but no one listened. He's so good at convincing everyone he's the victim. I'm listening now, and I have the resources to stop him." They talked for an hour. Jennifer's story was harrowing. Years of escalating abuse that started with emotional manipulation and progressed to physical violence. When Trevor was born, Barry's behavior became even more disturbing. "He said babies needed to be trained like animals," Jennifer explained. "He would pinch Trevor, shake him, leave him in his crib for hours when he cried. I tried to protect him, but Barry was smart. He never left marks where doctors would see them." "What made you finally leave?" "I came home early from work and found Barry holding a lit cigarette over Trevor's hand. He said he was teaching him about consequences." Trevor was 18 months old. Michael's jaw clenched. The pattern was clear. Barry was a predator who specifically targeted the most vulnerable victims. Children who couldn't fight back, couldn't report him, couldn't escape. "Jennifer, would you be willing to testify if this goes to trial?" I don't know. I built a new life here. Trevor's finally doing well in school, making friends. Barry doesn't know where we are. He'll find you eventually. Men like Barry always do. The only way to truly protect your son is to make sure Barry can never hurt another child. After ending the call, Michael added Jennifer's information to his growing case file. He now had Barry's pattern of behavior documented across 2 families, evidence of escalating violence, and a witness who could testify to Barry's disturbing statements about training babies. But Michael's investigation had also revealed something else. Barry wasn't working alone. The pharmaceutical company where Barry worked was owned by his uncle, Herbert Fulton. Herbert had a reputation for protecting family members, regardless of their behavior. More troubling, Herbert's company had been under FDA investigation twice for illegal testing practices, once for testing on patients without proper consent, and once for falsifying safety data. Michael suspected that Herbert was providing legal and financial support for Barry's defense, which meant Barry had access to expensive lawyers and unlimited resources to fight the charges. That evening, Michael met with Clark Richardson at a quiet bar downtown. Clark had been doing his own research into the Fulton family, and what he discovered was troubling. Herbert Fulton is connected, Clark explained, keeping his voice low. Not just money, political connections. The state attorney general's office has received significant donations from his company. The judge assigned to Barry's case? He's up for re-election next year. And guess who's been a major campaign contributor? Michael felt his stomach drop. You're saying Barry might walk? I'm saying the deck is stacked. Even with solid evidence, even with witnesses, Barry has advantages that most defendants don't have. His lawyers are already floating an insanity defense, claiming he was suffering from postpartum depression by proxy, some bullshit psychological condition they're making up. What about Marlene's testimony? She's unreliable. The defense will argue that she was suffering from actual postpartum depression, that her testimony is the result of psychological breakdown and false memories. They'll make her the villain and Barry the victim. Michael stared into his beer, processing the implications. The legal system that was supposed to protect Sophia might actually protect her abuser instead. There's something else, Clark continued. Barry's made threats. Not directly, but through intermediaries. He's letting people know that he considers you responsible for his arrest, and that he doesn't forget slights. I'm not worried about Barry. You should be. Men like him don't threaten unless they have a plan. And with Herbert's resources behind him. Clark left the sentence unfinished, but Michael understood. Barry wasn't just a child abuser. He was a child abuser with powerful connections and a vindictive streak. That night, Michael lay awake thinking about options. The legal system might fail Sophia. Barry might walk free, might even regain access to his daughter. The thought of that monster being allowed anywhere near Sophia again made Michael's blood boil. But Michael had spent 15 years in security work, and he understood that sometimes justice required more than courtrooms and judges. Sometimes it required people willing to step outside the system to protect the innocent. He thought about Jennifer Martinez, hiding across the country with her son. He thought about Sophia, lying in a hospital bed with burned scars that would mark her for life. He thought about Emma, asking innocent questions about baby Sophia's owies. By morning, Michael had made his decision. He would continue supporting the legal case, providing evidence and witness testimony. But he would also prepare for the possibility that the legal system would fail. And if it did, Barry Fulton would discover that there were consequences for hurting children, consequences that couldn't be bought off or influenced by political connections. Justice would be served, one way or another. Chapter 5, The Devil's Bargain. 2 weeks after Barry's arrest, Michael received an unexpected visitor. Herbert Fulton stood on his doorstep at 7 in the morning, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of cold calculation. Mr. Weston, I believe we need to have a conversation. Herbert was in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms and intimidated competitors. He radiated the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. Michael considered slamming the door in his face, but curiosity won out. What could we possibly have to discuss? The future of my nephew, for starters, and the welfare of your family. The thinly veiled threat wasn't lost on Michael. He stepped aside to let Herbert enter, but not before noting the black SUV parked across the street with 2 men inside. They sat in Michael's living room, Herbert declining the offer of coffee with a dismissive wave. Let me be direct, Mr. Weston. You've created a very expensive problem for my family. Barry's legal defense is costing me significant money, and this scandal is affecting my business relationships. Maybe you should have thought about that before enabling a child abuser." Herbert's smile was cold as winter. Barry is not a child abuser. He's a young father who made some mistakes under stress. The injuries to his daughter were accidents, caused by his inexperience and poor judgment. Nothing more. Michael stared at Herbert in disbelief. "I've seen the photos. Those weren't accidents. Photos can be misleading. Medical examiner reports can be reinterpreted. Witness testimony can be discredited." Herbert leaned forward slightly. "I'm offering you a way out of this situation that benefits everyone." "I'm listening." "Barry will plead guilty to a lesser charge, child endangerment rather than aggravated abuse. He'll serve 6 months in minimum security, undergo counseling, and permanently relinquish his parental rights to Sophia. Your sister-in-law keeps custody, Barry stays away from the child, and everyone moves on with their lives." Michael's first instinct was to throw Herbert out of his house, but his security training kicked in. Information was power, and Herbert was revealing his hand. "And what do I get out of this bargain?" "Peace of mind. Protection for your family." Barry is upset about his situation. He blames you for destroying his life. Young men with grievances can be unpredictable. There was the naked threat. Herbert was essentially offering to call off his attack dog in exchange for Michael's cooperation in minimizing Barry's punishment. "Let me understand this correctly," Michael said carefully. "You're threatening my family if I don't agree to let Barry walk away with a slap on the wrist for torturing a baby. I'm offering a reasonable solution to an unfortunate situation. Barry gets help, the baby is protected, and no one else gets hurt." Michael stood up. "Get out of my house." Herbert rose slowly, straightening his suit jacket. "I'd hoped you'd be reasonable. Successful men like us should be able to find common ground. Successful men like us don't torture babies." "No," Herbert agreed. "But we do protect our families from threats. Just as I'm protecting Barry, I'm sure you'll do whatever it takes to protect Emma and Virginia." The use of their names was deliberate, a reminder that Herbert knew where they lived, where Emma went to school, where Virginia worked. After Herbert left, Michael immediately called Clark Richardson. "Herbert Fulton just made a house call," Michael explained. "He's offering a plea bargain and threatening my family if I don't cooperate." "Jesus, what did you tell him?" "To get out." "But Clark, this changes things. He's not just protecting Barry. He's actively threatening witnesses. That's obstruction of justice." "Can you prove it?" "Did you record the conversation?" "No, but..." "Then it's your word against a millionaire with political connections." "Michael, you need to take his threats seriously. Herbert doesn't make empty promises." That afternoon, Michael picked up Emma from school personally instead of letting her take the bus. As they walked to his car, he noticed the same black SUV from that morning parked near the school entrance. "Daddy, why are you walking so fast?" Emma asked, struggling to keep up. "Just want to get home to Mommy," Michael replied, keeping his voice light while scanning for additional threats. That evening, he sat Virginia down and explained the situation. "They're threatening us." Virginia's voice was incredulous. "Because we protected a baby from abuse. Because we exposed Barry and cost Herbert money and reputation. To men like that, family reputation is everything. So what do we do?" "Michael, I've been thinking about that all day. Short term, we increase security. I'm going to install a new alarm system, and I want you and Emma to stick to public places with lots of people. No shortcuts, no isolated parking lots. And long term, I'm going to make sure Herbert understands that threatening my family was the biggest mistake of his life." Over the next few days, Michael put his plan into motion. He hired private security for Emma's school and Virginia's workplace. Discreet protection that would be invisible to casual observation, but ready to respond to any threats. He also began documenting everything. Herbert's visit, the SUV following them, unusual phone calls, anything that could be used as evidence of witness intimidation. But Michael's real plan was more ambitious. Herbert had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that Michael was just another victim who would cave under pressure. He hadn't realized that Michael had spent 15 years learning how to take apart people who thought they were untouchable. Michael began a deep investigation into Herbert's business practices. The pharmaceutical company had government contracts worth millions, all dependent on maintaining security clearances and regulatory approvals. If Michael could find evidence of illegal activities, and he was confident he could destroy Herbert's business empire. More importantly, he could use that leverage to ensure Barry received the full punishment he deserved. 3 days later, Lewis Klein called with interesting news. "You were right about Herbert Fulton," Lewis said. "His company's been cutting corners on drug testing for years. I found a whistleblower, a former employee who was fired for questioning their safety protocols. Is he willing to talk?" She, Dr. Rosalie Nixon, former research director. She's been trying to get someone to listen to her for 2 years. She has documentation of falsified test results, cover-ups of adverse reactions, even evidence that they tested unapproved drugs on patients without consent. Michael felt a surge of satisfaction. Herbert had chosen the wrong opponent. "Set up a meeting," Michael said. "It's time to show Herbert Fulton what a real threat looks like." The game was changing, and Michael intended to win. Chapter 6. The Trap is Set. Dr. Rosalie Nixon met Michael at a coffee shop in the next town over, her nervous energy apparent from the moment she sat down. She was in her 40s with graying hair and tired eyes that spoke of someone who'd been fighting a losing battle for too long. "Mr. Weston, I have to ask, why are you interested in Fulton Pharmaceuticals? Are you a journalist? Law enforcement?" "Neither. Herbert Fulton threatened my family because we exposed his nephew as a child abuser. I'm returning the favor." Rosalie's expression shifted from wariness to something approaching relief. "Then we have a common enemy." For the next 2 hours, Rosalie laid out a pattern of criminal behavior that spanned decades. Fulton Pharmaceuticals had been systematically falsifying drug test results, bribing FDA inspectors, and testing experimental drugs on unwitting patients in low-income clinics. "The worst part is the pediatric trials," Rosalie explained, sliding a folder across the table. "They've been testing unapproved medications on children in foster care, kids whose guardians are paid to consent without understanding the risks." Michael felt sick. Herbert Fulton's company had been harming children for years, and no one had stopped them. "Why haven't you gone to the authorities?" "I have. The FDA inspector assigned to our case is on Herbert's payroll. The state attorney general's office won't return my calls. Herbert has connections everywhere." "What about federal authorities?" "FBI. I tried. They said they needed more evidence. A smoking gun. Everything I have could be explained away as paperwork errors or misunderstandings." Michael studied the documents Rosalie had provided. She was right. Individually, each piece of evidence could be dismissed. But together, they painted a clear picture of systematic criminal activity. What would constitute a smoking gun? Direct evidence of bribery. Recorded conversations. Documentation showing Herbert personally ordered illegal activities. Rosalie paused. Or testimony from someone inside the company who participated in the crimes. Michael's mind began working through possibilities. He needed to get close to Herbert's operation, gain access to records and conversations that would provide irrefutable evidence. "Rosalie, does Herbert's company ever hire outside security consultants?" "All the time. They're paranoid about industrial espionage, especially with all the dirty secrets they're hiding." "What kind of consultants?" "Background checks, facility security assessments, computer network protection." "Why?" Michael smiled. "Sometimes the best way to infiltrate an organization was to let them invite you in." 2 days later, Michael sat in the plush offices of Fulton Pharmaceuticals, wearing his best suit and carrying a portfolio of his most impressive security work. He'd created a fictional consulting company called Titan Security Solutions, complete with website, references, and a track record of protecting corporate secrets. Herbert's security director, Marco Allison, was clearly impressed by Michael's credentials. "We've had some concerns about information leaks," Marco explained. "Someone's been feeding information to former employees, possibly industrial espionage. Herbert wants a complete assessment of our security vulnerabilities." "I can help with that," Michael replied. "But I'll need access to everything: personnel files, computer systems, communication records. If there's a leak, I'll find it. Money's no object." Herbert wants this resolved quickly and quietly. Michael spent the next week embedding himself in Fulton Pharmaceuticals, officially looking for security leaks while actually documenting crimes. He installed monitoring software on their computers that would capture all communications. He photographed financial records showing payments to FDA officials. He recorded conversations where Herbert personally ordered employees to falsify test results. The smoking gun came on Thursday afternoon when Michael overheard Herbert on a phone call with a clinic director in Detroit. "I don't care about consent forms," Herbert was saying. "These kids are wards of the state. Nobody's going to ask questions. Just document that the guardians approve the trials and bill us for the consultations." Michael's hidden recorder captured every word. Herbert had just confessed to illegally experimenting on children in foster care. But Michael's investigation had also revealed something more disturbing. Herbert's plans for dealing with the Barry situation weren't limited to witness intimidation. In Herbert's private files, Michael found communications with a private military contractor called Apex Solutions. The emails discussed permanent solutions to the Weston problem and referenced a payment of $200,000 for services that weren't specifically detailed. Michael photographed everything and transmitted the files to a secure server he'd set up. Herbert wasn't just threatening his family, he was planning to have them killed. That evening, Michael met with Clark Richardson and Dr. Nixon at a secure location. "This is it," Michael said, spreading the evidence across the table. Herbert confessing to illegal human experimentation. Financial records showing bribes. Documentation of threats against witnesses. "The FBI will have to act on this." "What about your family?" Clark asked. "Once you turn this over, Herbert will know you've been inside his organization. The threats against you will escalate. That's why we're going to move fast. I'm calling FBI Special Agent Dominic Ollie tomorrow morning. By tomorrow afternoon, Herbert and his whole organization will be under federal investigation." Dr. Nixon looked at the evidence with tears in her eyes. "All those children they hurt. Finally, someone will pay." "Someone will pay," Michael agreed. "But I'm not done with Herbert yet." "What do you mean?" Michael's expression hardened. "Herbert made this personal when he threatened my family. The FBI will handle the corporate crimes, but Herbert needs to understand that there are consequences for threatening innocent people." Clark shook his head. "Michael, whatever you're planning, don't. You've got him. The legal system will handle this. The legal system will put him in minimum security for a few years, maybe white-collar prison if he's unlucky. That's not justice for the children he's hurt. It's not your job to dispense justice. It became my job when he threatened Emma." Michael had already decided. Herbert Fulton was about to learn that some people couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, and wouldn't back down when their families were threatened. The trap was set. Now it was time to spring it. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Begins. FBI Special Agent Dominic Ollie was a tall, serious man who listened to Michael's evidence presentation without interrupting. When Michael finished, Ollie sat back in his chair and whistled softly. "Mr. Weston, this is the most comprehensive corporate crime case I've seen in 20 years. Where did you say you got this evidence?" "I was hired as a security consultant to investigate information leaks at Fulton Pharmaceuticals. Everything I discovered was within the scope of my authorized access." It was technically true, though it omitted the part where Michael had manipulated his way into the company under false pretenses. "And you recorded these conversations legally?" "I was conducting a security assessment that included monitoring corporate communications for potential threats. Herbert Fulton personally authorized me to access all company communications." Again, technically true. Herbert had signed a broad authorization form without reading the fine print, which gave Michael extensive surveillance authority. "This is enough to bring down their entire operation," Ollie said, studying the financial records. "RICO charges, FDA violations, conspiracy, bribery, human experimentation. Herbert Fulton is looking at life in prison. What about the threats against my family? Witness intimidation, conspiracy to commit murder if we can prove intent with this Apex Solutions connection. We'll have enough to arrest him today. How long before you move? Give me 6 hours to coordinate with FDA and get arrest warrants. By this afternoon, Herbert Fulton's empire comes crashing down. As Michael left the FBI field office, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. Come alone. Your family's safety depends on it. Michael recognized the manipulation tactic immediately. Create urgency, isolate the target, use fear as motivation. But he also knew that ignoring the message could put Virginia and Emma at greater risk. He texted Clark Richardson with the warehouse address and a message to call the FBI if he didn't check in within 2 hours. Then he drove to the meeting. The warehouse district was largely abandoned, a collection of crumbling buildings that had once housed the city's manufacturing base. The address led to a massive concrete structure with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. Michael parked and walked toward the building, his hand resting on the concealed pistol he'd carried since Herbert's threats began. His security training had included extensive firearms instruction, and he was prepared to use the weapon if necessary. Inside the warehouse, Barry Fulton waited in the center of the empty space. He looked different, thinner, more desperate, with the wild eyes of someone who'd been pushed past his breaking point. "Hello, Michael. Thank you for coming. Where's Herbert?" Michael asked, scanning the shadows for additional threats. "Uncle Herbert is handling some business problems. Something about FBI raids and federal agents, asking uncomfortable questions." Barry's smile was ugly. "Seems like someone's been very busy gathering evidence. Your uncle made some poor choices. Now he's paying for them. My uncle is a good man who tried to help his family. You destroyed his life because you couldn't mind your own business." Michael almost laughed. "I exposed you for torturing a baby. Everything that followed was consequence. That baby is my daughter. I had every right to discipline her however I saw fit. She's 3 weeks old, you psychopath. She can't even hold her head up, let alone understand discipline." Barry's face twisted with rage. "You don't understand anything about raising children. You've made Emma soft, weak. Children need to learn that actions have consequences." The mention of Emma made Michael's blood run cold. "Stay away from my family. Or what? You'll call the police? You'll gather more evidence." Barry pulled a gun from his jacket. "The time for evidence is over." Michael evaluated his options. Barry was 20 feet away, holding the weapon steady, but with obvious inexperience. The gun looked expensive, probably one of Herbert's contributions to Barry's defense fund. "You think killing me solves your problems?" Michael asked, keeping his voice calm while calculating angles and distances. "I think killing you sends a message. Touch my family, destroy my life, and there are consequences. The FBI already has everything they need. Killing me won't stop the investigation. Maybe not, but it'll make me feel better." Barry raised the gun, but Michael was already moving. 15 years of security work had kept him in excellent physical condition, and he'd trained for exactly this type of situation. He dove behind a concrete pillar as Barry fired, the shot echoing through the empty warehouse. "You can't hide forever," Barry shouted, advancing through the shadows. Michael drew his own weapon, waiting for Barry to make a mistake. He didn't have to wait long. Barry rounded the pillar too aggressively, expecting to find Michael cowering. Instead, he found Michael's gun barrel pressed against his forehead. "Drop it," Michael said quietly. Barry's eyes went wide with fear and rage. "You won't shoot me. You're not a killer." "You're right," Michael agreed. "I'm not a killer, but I'm someone who protects his family from threats. And you, Barry, are a threat. The police won't believe. The police will find you here with a gun, having lured me to a deserted location after threatening my family. They'll call it self-defense." For the first time since Michael had known him, Barry Fulton looked genuinely afraid. "Please," Barry whispered. "I was just trying to scare you. I wasn't really going to hurt anyone. Like you weren't really going to hurt Sophia." Michael heard sirens in the distance. Either Clark had called for backup, or someone had reported the gunshots. "Here's what's going to happen," Michael said, taking Barry's gun and stepping back. "You're going to lie face down on the ground with your hands behind your head. You're going to wait for the police to arrive. And you're going to confess to everything, the abuse, the threats, all of it. And if I don't, then I'll assume you're still a threat to my family, and I'll handle you accordingly." Barry slowly lowered himself to the ground, his spirit finally broken. As the police sirens grew louder, Michael allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Herbert's empire was crumbling. Barry was finished, and Michael's family was safe. But the reckoning wasn't over yet. Chapter 8. Justice Served. The news broke across the state within hours. Herbert Fulton, pharmaceutical executive and political donor, arrested on federal charges including human experimentation, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. The scandal sent shockwaves through the medical and political communities. Michael sat in Detective Carter's office, giving his statement about the warehouse confrontation while watching news coverage on the office television. "Barry's lawyer is claiming you entrapped him," Carter said, closing his notebook. "Says you manipulated him into the meeting. Barry sent the threat. I responded to protect my family. Everything I did was self-defense. The gun Barry was carrying, it's not registered to him. Looks like Herbert bought it and had an associate deliver it to Barry this morning. We've got the whole chain documented." Michael wasn't surprised. Herbert had been desperate, willing to use his nephew as a disposable weapon rather than face the consequences of his crimes. What happens to Barry now? He's looking at serious time. Attempted murder, plus the original child abuse charges. His uncle's not going to be able to help him where he's going. On the television, a reporter was interviewing Dr. Rosalie Nixon outside the FDA headquarters. She looked relieved but determined as she described years of illegal activities at Fulton Pharmaceuticals. "The most disturbing aspect," Dr. Nixon was saying, "is the systematic abuse of children in foster care. These were kids with no one to protect them, and Herbert Fulton's company treated them like laboratory animals." Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Virginia. "Come home. Marlene wants to see you." He found Marlene in his living room, holding baby Sophia. The infant looked healthier than she had since birth. The hospital care had helped her gain weight, and the burns were healing well thanks to specialized treatment. "Michael," Marlene said, standing as he entered, "I owe you an apology. And my gratitude. You don't owe me anything." "I do. I was a coward. I knew what Barry was doing, but I was too scared to stop him. I told myself I was protecting our marriage, our future. But I was just protecting myself." Virginia sat beside her sister, offering silent support. "He told me that no one would believe me," Marlene continued. "He said that if I ever tried to leave him or report him, he'd make sure I lost Sophia forever. He said his uncle had enough money and connections to destroy me in court. But you knew the abuse was happening." Marlene nodded, tears streaming down her face. "The first time, I found him holding a cigarette over her arm. He said he was teaching her about heat so she wouldn't burn herself on the stove when she got older. It was insane, but he made it sound reasonable. Why didn't you call the police then?" "I tried to leave. I packed a bag and went to my mother's house. But Barry showed up with his uncle's lawyers and a court order claiming I was having a mental breakdown. They said I was an unfit mother, that I was imagining things. It made me look crazy." Michael understood. Herbert's network of corrupt officials and expensive lawyers could manipulate the system to protect family members, even from legitimate accusations. Then Barry started being more careful, Marlene continued. "He'd hurt her when I was out, or when I was sleeping. He'd tell me the marks were diaper rash or accidents. And when I questioned him, he'd remind me that no one would believe a woman with a history of mental problems." "What changed your mind about telling the truth?" "Seeing how you and Virginia reacted. Seeing people who actually cared about protecting Sophia, not about protecting family reputation or avoiding scandal. I realized that staying silent was just as bad as hurting her myself." Sophia stirred in Marlene's arms, making the soft cooing sounds that newborns make when they're content. The contrast between this peaceful moment and the images of her burn-covered body 3 weeks ago was stark. "What happens now?" Marlene asked. "Now Sophia gets to grow up safe," Michael replied. "Barry's going to prison for a very long time. Herbert's company is finished, and he'll be in federal prison until he's an old man. The threat to your family is over." That evening, Michael sat in his backyard watching Emma play on her swing set. Virginia joined him with 2 glasses of wine, settling into the chair beside him. "It's really over?" she asked. "It's over." Barry pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a 25-year sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in 15 years, but given his history, I doubt he'll ever see the outside again. And Herbert, federal prosecutors are seeking life without parole. The human experimentation charges alone carry mandatory minimums that will keep him locked up forever. Virginia sipped her wine, watching Emma's carefree play. I keep thinking about all those children Herbert's company hurt. Kids in foster care who had no one to protect them. Dr. Nixon is working with victim advocates to identify all the children who were used in illegal trials. They'll get compensation and medical care. It won't undo the damage, but it's something. You save them, you know. All of them. Not just Sophia. Michael shook his head. I just exposed the truth. The real heroes are people like Dr. Nixon, who spent years trying to get someone to listen. And people like you, who listened and acted. Emma ran over to them, her face flushed with excitement. Daddy, Mommy, can we call Aunt Marlene and see if baby Sophia can come play? Michael smiled, lifting Emma onto his lap. Maybe when she's a little older, princess. Right now, she's still too little to play. But when she gets bigger, we can teach her games and read her stories. Absolutely. You're going to be the best big cousin ever. As the sun set behind their house, Michael felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The legal system had worked, justice had been served, and his family was safe. More importantly, a baby who had suffered unimaginable cruelty would grow up knowing that people had fought to protect her. Sometimes the good guys really did win. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 6 months later, Michael stood in the courthouse hallway, adjusting his tie while waiting for the final hearing in the Fulton case. Barry had already been sentenced and transferred to federal prison. Today was Herbert's sentencing hearing, the culmination of a federal case that had exposed one of the largest pharmaceutical fraud schemes in recent history. Dr. Rosalie Nixon approached him, looking more confident than she had during their first meeting. The FBI investigation had vindicated her years of whistleblowing attempts, and she'd been hired as a consultant by the Department of Health and Human Services to investigate similar cases. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "I've been ready for 6 months," Michael replied. Through the courtroom doors, they could see Herbert Fulton sitting at the defense table. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and intimidated rivals now looked frail and defeated. His empire had crumbled, his political connections had abandoned him, and his family name had become synonymous with corruption and child abuse. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who was known for harsh sentences in cases involving children, called the court to order. "Mr. Fulton," she began, looking down at Herbert with obvious distaste. "In my 40 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a systematic disregard for human dignity and child welfare. Your company's actions constitute some of the most heinous corporate crimes in recent memory." Herbert's expensive lawyers had tried every defense imaginable: diminished capacity, scapegoating subordinates, claiming ignorance of the illegal activities. None of it had worked. The evidence Michael had gathered was too comprehensive, too damning. "The prosecution has recommended life imprisonment without the possibility of parole," the judge continued. "Given the scope of your crimes and the vulnerability of your victims, I find that recommendation appropriate. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment in federal custody." Herbert slumped in his chair as the bailiffs approached to lead him away. As he passed Michael's row, their eyes met for a moment. There was no defiance left in Herbert, only the hollow stare of a man who had finally faced consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. Outside the courthouse, Michael was approached by news reporters seeking comment on the case that had captivated the state for months. "Mr. Weston, many people are calling you a hero for exposing the Fulton conspiracy. How do you respond to that?" Michael considered the question carefully. "I'm not a hero. I'm a father and uncle who did what anyone should do when they discover a child is being hurt. The real heroes are people like Dr. Nixon, who spent years trying to get authorities to listen, and Detective Carter, who built the case that put these criminals behind bars. What's next for you?" "I'm going home to my family. That's all I ever wanted to do." That evening, Michael and Virginia hosted a small celebration dinner. Marlene was there with Sophia, who at 8 months old was a happy, healthy baby showing no lasting effects from her early trauma. Emma was teaching her infant cousin to play peekaboo, both children giggling with pure joy. Clark Richardson and Lewis Klein had joined them, along with Dr. Nixon and Detective Carter. It felt good to have everyone who had helped bring justice to the Fultons gathered in one place. "I have an announcement," Dr. Nixon said as they finished dinner. "The Department of Health and Human Services has offered me a position leading a new task force to investigate pharmaceutical companies that may be conducting illegal testing. We're going to make sure what happened at Fulton Pharmaceuticals never happens again." Everyone applauded. It was fitting that Dr. Nixon's years of fighting for child safety had led to a position where she could protect even more children. "And I have news too," Marlene added quietly. "I've been accepted to nursing school. I want to work in pediatrics, helping children who've been hurt like Sophia was." Michael felt a surge of pride for his sister-in-law. Marlene had found the strength to turn her experience into something positive, something that would help other children. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Michael sat in Emma's room while she told him about her day at school. "Daddy, my teacher says you're famous because you helped catch bad guys." "I just did what I thought was right, princess." "Like a superhero?" Michael smiled. "Not like a superhero. Superheroes have special powers. I just have a family that I love very much." "Is baby Sophia safe now?" "Yes, sweetheart. Baby Sophia is very safe. The bad people who hurt her are in jail, and they can never hurt her again." Emma nodded solemnly. "Good. Babies shouldn't get hurt." "No, they shouldn't. And as long as there are people willing to stand up for them, babies like Sophia will be protected." After tucking Emma into bed, Michael found Virginia in their bedroom, looking through photo albums from the past year. She'd been documenting Sophia's recovery and growth, creating a record of the baby's journey from victim to thriving infant. "Look at this," Virginia said, showing him a recent photo of Sophia laughing while Emma played with her. "You'd never know what she went through." "Children are resilient," Michael replied, settling beside his wife. "With love and care, they can overcome almost anything." "Do you think she'll remember any of it? The pain, the fear?" "I hope not. But if she does, she'll also remember that people fought to protect her. She'll know that she was worth fighting for." Virginia leaned against his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, not just for what you did, but for how you did it. You could have taken justice into your own hands, could have hurt Barry and Herbert the way they hurt Sophia. But you didn't." "I wanted to," Michael admitted. "There are moments when I thought about what I could do to make them suffer the way they made Sophia suffer. But that wouldn't have been justice. It would have been revenge. And revenge wouldn't have protected other children the way the legal system has." "Do you ever regret not taking that path?" Michael considered the question. Barry was serving 25 years in federal prison, where child abusers faced their own form of justice from other inmates. Herbert would die behind bars, his fortune seized to compensate his victims, his name forever associated with the torture of children. The legal system had delivered consequences more severe than anything Michael could have imposed personally. "No," he said finally. "This was better. This was real justice." As they prepared for bed, Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Martinez, Barry's ex-wife. "Thank you for making Trevor safe. He's sleeping through the night for the first time in years." Michael showed the message to Virginia, who smiled through tears. "How many children do you think we saved?" she asked. "All of them," Michael replied. "Every child who would have been hurt by Barry in the future. Every child who would have been used in Herbert's illegal trials. All of them." Outside their window, the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. Families were safe in their homes, children sleeping soundly in their beds. It was the kind of ordinary, precious normalcy that Michael had fought to protect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases in his security work, new threats to investigate and neutralize. But tonight, his family was safe, Sophia was healing, and two monsters who preyed on children were locked away forever. Justice had been served, and it had been worth every risk, every sleepless night, every moment of fear. As Michael drifted off to sleep, he thought about Emma's question about superheroes. Maybe he wasn't a superhero, but he'd learned something important. Ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves. And that was enough. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. Anthony Huffman stood in his mahogany-paneled office, staring out at the Seattle skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. At 42, he commanded respect in the city's elite circles, a self-made millionaire who'd built his security consulting firm from nothing. His reputation was built on one simple principle: loyalty was everything, and betrayal was unforgivable. The irony wasn't lost on him that the woman who'd shared his bed for 15 years was about to shatter that very foundation. Margaret Huffman sat across from divorce attorney Phyllis Solis, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the conference table. At 38, Margaret had transformed from the struggling art student Anthony had married into a polished society wife. But beneath that facade lurked ambitions that had grown too large for their marriage to contain. "Mrs. Huffman," Phyllis said, sliding documents across the table, "your husband's financial portfolio is substantial. We're talking about a $50 million empire." Margaret's green eyes gleamed. "And my children? Full custody is challenging, but not impossible. Your husband has no criminal record, no history of abuse. What if there were concerns about his mental stability?" Margaret interrupted. Phyllis raised an eyebrow. "That would require professional evaluation and documentation." Margaret smiled, thinking of her boyfriend, Carlos Waters. A decorated police sergeant with 15 years on the force, Carlos had connections that could prove invaluable. More importantly, he'd do anything for her, a weakness she intended to exploit fully. That evening, Anthony returned to their Bellevue mansion to find Margaret arranging flowers in the foyer. Their children, Jeremy, 16, and Laura, 14, were upstairs doing homework. The picture of domestic tranquility, a facade that had been crumbling for months. "How was your day?" Margaret asked without looking up. "Profitable," Anthony replied, studying his wife's profile. He'd built his fortune reading people, identifying threats before they materialized. Every instinct screamed that Margaret was planning something, but he'd underestimated how far she'd already progressed. "Anthony, we need to talk about us," Margaret said, finally meeting his gaze. "I'm listening. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Anthony's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders squared, his hands stilled. She'd just declared war on a man who'd never lost a battle. "I see," Anthony said quietly. "And the children? They'll be better off with me. You're always traveling, always working. They need stability." Anthony nodded slowly, his mind already calculating possibilities. "I assume you've given this considerable thought. More than you know." As Margaret walked away, Anthony pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Franklin? It's Anthony Huffman. I need a call on that favor." Franklin Gilmore had been Anthony's military intelligence partner in Afghanistan, now running a private investigation firm. If Margaret thought she could outmaneuver someone who'd hunted terrorists in Kandahar, she was about to learn otherwise. Chapter 2. The Enemy Within. 2 weeks later, Anthony sat in Franklin's downtown office, reviewing surveillance footage on multiple monitors. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. "She's been meeting with Carlos Waters for 3 months, Franklin reported, his weathered face grim. Seattle PD sergeant, divorced last year, known for bending rules when it suits him. The footage showed Margaret and Carlos in intimate embraces at various hotels around the city. But it was the final clip that truly unveiled the scope of their betrayal. "This was recorded yesterday at Waters' apartment," Franklin continued, enhancing the audio. Margaret's voice crackled through the speakers. "The psychological evaluation is next week. Dr. Nina Slaughter owes Carlos a favor. Something about evidence disappearing from a domestic violence case. She'll write whatever we need." Carlos's voice followed. "What exactly are we documenting?" "Paranoid personality disorder, potential for violence, history of controlling behavior. Enough to convince Judge Haley that the children aren't safe. Anthony's hands clenched into fists. Dr. Nina Slaughter was a respected child psychologist who'd built her career on protecting vulnerable children. The idea that she'd fabricate evidence to destroy a family was sickening, but not surprising. Everyone had secrets, and Carlos had obviously found hers. "There's more," Franklin said, switching to another monitor. "Judge Glenn Haley has been gambling heavily at the Tulip Casino. He's deep in debt to some very unpleasant people. Waters has been providing protection in exchange for favorable rulings." The picture was becoming clear. Margaret hadn't just found herself a lover. She'd found herself a criminal conspiracy. They were planning to steal his children using forged documents and a corrupted judicial system. Anthony stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. In Afghanistan, he learned that sometimes good men had to do terrible things to protect what mattered most. Margaret had chosen her battlefield. Now she discovered what happened when you declared war on someone who'd perfected the art of destruction. "Franklin, I need you to dig deeper. Find everything. Waters' service record, Slaughter's patient files, Haley's gambling debts. I want to know every secret, every weakness, every pressure point." And then Anthony turned back to his old friend, his eyes holding the cold fury that had once terrified insurgents in a war zone. "Then we teach them what real paranoia looks like." That night, Anthony returned home to find Jeremy shooting basketball hoops in the driveway. His son had inherited his mother's artistic features, but Anthony's sharp intelligence. At 16, Jeremy was already showing signs of a strategic thinking that had made Anthony successful. "Dad, can we talk?" Jeremy asked, palming the basketball. They sat on the porch steps, the Seattle evening air crisp with approaching autumn. Anthony studied his son's face, noting the tension around his eyes. "What's on your mind?" "It's Mom," Jeremy said carefully. "She's been different lately. Secretive. And there's this cop who keeps calling." Anthony felt a surge of protective rage. Margaret's betrayal was devastating enough, but involving their children in her deception crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "What kind of different?" "She's been asking weird questions about you, about your temper, about whether you've ever scared us. And yesterday, I overheard her on the phone talking about some doctor's appointment that we're all supposed to go to." The psychological evaluation. Margaret was already poisoning their children's minds, preparing them to testify against their own father. "Jeremy, I want you to listen carefully," Anthony said, his voice steady despite the fury building inside him. "Your mother and I are having problems. But whatever happens, remember that I love you and Laura more than my own life. Nothing will ever change that." Jeremy nodded, but Anthony could see the confusion and fear in his son's eyes. Margaret wasn't just destroying their marriage. She was traumatizing their children in the process. As Anthony tucked Laura into bed later that evening, she asked, "Daddy, are you and Mommy getting divorced?" The innocent question hit him like a physical blow. Laura had always been the sensitive one, the peacemaker who tried to fix everything with hugs and hand-drawn pictures. "We're working through some difficulties, sweetheart," Anthony said, smoothing her hair. "But no matter what happens, you'll always be my little girl." Laura hugged him tightly. "I don't want you to go away." "I'm not going anywhere," Anthony promised, though he knew Margaret was planning to ensure exactly that. After the children were asleep, Anthony found Margaret in her study, typing on her laptop. She closed it quickly when he entered. "Planning something?" he asked casually. "Just correspondence," she replied, but her voice carried a defensive edge. Anthony nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Margaret, you should know that I've never made idle threats in my life. But if you try to take my children from me, you'll discover exactly how dangerous a desperate father can become." The threat hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Margaret's confident facade wavered. She'd married Anthony when he was building his empire, but she'd never seen the darker skills that had made his success possible. "Is that a threat, Anthony?" "It's a promise," he said quietly, and walked away. That night, as Margaret lay beside him pretending to sleep, Anthony stared at the ceiling and began planning his war. Margaret thought she was playing chess, but she was about to discover she'd brought checkers to a match against a grandmaster. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. The family meeting with Dr. Nina Slaughter took place in her sterile downtown office. All white walls and abstract art designed to appear non-threatening. Margaret sat beside Carlos, who'd been introduced as a family friend, while Anthony observed from across the room with Jeremy and Laura flanking him. Dr. Slaughter was a thin woman in her 50s with graying hair and calculating eyes. Anthony watched her carefully, noting how she avoided direct eye contact with him while showering attention on Margaret and the children. "This is just an informal assessment," Dr. Slaughter explained, though Anthony noticed the recording equipment on her desk. "I want to understand the family dynamics and ensure everyone's emotional well-being during this difficult transition." For the next hour, she asked seemingly innocuous questions that Anthony recognized as carefully crafted traps. Every query about his work schedule, his temper, his relationship with the children was designed to build a narrative of an absent, potentially dangerous father. Margaret played her part perfectly, mentioning Anthony's unpredictable moods and his obsession with control. Carlos nodded sympathetically, occasionally adding observations about how law enforcement recognized the warning signs of domestic instability. But Anthony had spent 15 years reading hostile interrogators, and Dr. Slaughter's technique was amateur by comparison. More importantly, he noticed something she didn't expect him to see: a small, encrypted recording device taped beneath her desk, obviously placed there by Carlos to capture conversations for later manipulation. When the session ended, Dr. Slaughter promised her report would be ready for the custody hearing next week. As they left the building, Anthony watched Carlos whisper something in Margaret's ear that made her smile. That evening, Anthony received an encrypted message from Franklin. "Package delivered. Check your secure email." The intelligence file Franklin had compiled was devastating. Dr. Slaughter had been taking bribes for favorable evaluations for 3 years, funded by various law enforcement officers who needed problematic cases to disappear. Carlos wasn't just a dirty cop. He was running a systematic corruption scheme that extended throughout the King County family court system. Judge Glenn Haley owed over $200,000 to casino loan sharks, money he'd borrowed to fund a gambling addiction that had destroyed his previous marriage. Carlos had been making his payments in exchange for predetermined rulings in custody cases. But the most shocking revelation was personal. Carlos Waters was Laura's biological father. Anthony stared at the DNA analysis Franklin had obtained from hair samples. The affair had been going on for over 14 years, meaning Margaret had been lying about Laura's parentage since her birth. The betrayal cut deeper than Anthony had thought possible. A knock on his study door interrupted his thoughts. Jeremy entered, looking unusually serious for a 16-year-old. "Dad, I need to tell you something about today." Anthony closed the laptop and gave his son full attention. "What is it?" "That doctor, she was asking weird questions. And when you left to use the bathroom, she told me and Laura that sometimes fathers can become dangerous when families break apart. She wanted to know if you'd ever hurt us or made us feel unsafe." The manipulation was even more insidious than Anthony had realized. Dr. Slaughter wasn't just planning to fabricate evidence. She was grooming his children to provide it. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you've never hurt us. Never even raised your voice." "But Dad," Jeremy hesitated. "I don't think she wanted to hear that." Anthony felt a surge of pride mixed with protective fury. His son was demonstrating the same analytical intelligence that had served Anthony well in business and war. "Jeremy, I need you to understand something. There are people who want to separate our family, and they're willing to lie to do it. Your mother believes she's doing what's best, but she's being manipulated by someone very dangerous." "The cop." "Yes. Carlos Waters is not the man he pretends to be." Jeremy absorbed this information with mature consideration. "What can we do?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning generations. Anthony had sworn to protect his children from the darker aspects of his nature, but circumstances were forcing a choice between their innocence and their safety. "I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say when I say it." "Can you do that?" Jeremy nodded solemnly. "What about Laura?" Anthony looked toward his daughter's room, where she was probably drawing pictures or reading one of her fantasy novels, blissfully unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. Laura doesn't need to know everything yet. But Jeremy, you're old enough to understand that sometimes good people have to make hard choices to protect the people they love. Like in Afghanistan, Anthony had never discussed his military service in detail, but Jeremy was perceptive enough to understand that his father's skills extended beyond business consulting. Exactly like Afghanistan. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Anthony sat in his study and made a series of encrypted phone calls. By morning, he'd assembled a team of specialists from his military days, men who understood that sometimes justice required working outside the system. Spencer Stewart, his former demolitions expert, now ran a private security firm in Tacoma. Doug Bowers, his old intelligence analyst, worked as a forensic accountant specializing in financial crimes. Morris Carpenter, their former medic, had become a highly skilled investigator with a talent for extracting information from reluctant sources. Each man owed Anthony their life from various missions in Afghanistan. More importantly, each understood that some betrayals demanded consequences that went far beyond legal remedies. The custody hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. Margaret, Carlos, and Dr. Slaughter believed they held all the cards: a corrupt judge, fabricated evidence, and a system designed to favor mothers in custody disputes. They were about to discover that Anthony Huffman played by different rules entirely. As he finalized his plans, Anthony reflected on the man he'd once been, someone who believed in justice, honor, and the fundamental goodness of people. Margaret's betrayal had killed that man, leaving something far more dangerous in his place. She'd wanted a divorce, and she'd get one. But she'd also learned that stealing a man's children carried a price that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The war was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Art of War. Friday morning arrived with Seattle's typical October drizzle. The courtroom at King County Superior Court filled with the usual collection of broken families seeking judicial resolution. Anthony entered wearing his best charcoal suit, projecting the calm confidence of a man who'd spent years in hostile environments. Margaret sat with her attorney Phyllis Solis at the plaintiff's table, Carlos Waters conspicuously absent, but undoubtedly monitoring the proceedings from outside. Dr. Slaughter occupied a seat in the gallery, her fabricated psychological evaluation tucked neatly in her briefcase. Judge Glenn Haley took the bench precisely at 9 a.m., his bloodshot eyes and nervous demeanor betraying the pressure he was under. Anthony noted the subtle tremor in the judge's hands. A man being crushed by debts he couldn't pay and choices he couldn't undo. Your Honor, Phyllis Solis began, we're here because of serious concerns about Mr. Huffman's fitness as a parent. Dr. Slaughter's psychological evaluation has identified several troubling patterns. Dr. Slaughter was called to testify, her professional demeanor masking the corruption beneath. She spoke eloquently about Anthony's controlling behavior, his potential for violence, and his inability to provide emotional stability for the children. The fabricated report painted Anthony as a dangerous father whose business success masked deep psychological problems. Every carefully chosen phrase was designed to justify awarding Margaret full custody and significant alimony from Anthony's fortune. When Anthony's attorney, Bradley Ward, cross-examined Dr. Slaughter, she remained composed and confident. Her answers were rehearsed, her professional credentials impeccable. To an outside observer, she appeared to be a dedicated child psychologist protecting vulnerable children from an unstable father. But Anthony noticed what others missed: the slight facial tic when she lied, the way her eyes shifted toward Judge Haley when she wanted confirmation, the unconscious gesture of touching her left earring whenever she fabricated details. After 2 hours of testimony, Judge Haley called a recess. Anthony stepped outside the courtroom to find Jeremy waiting in the hallway, looking unusually nervous for a teenager. "Dad, I need to give you something," Jeremy said, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. He handed Anthony a small envelope, the paper slightly crumpled for being concealed. "Don't worry, I handled everything." Anthony opened the envelope to find a micro SD card and a handwritten note. recording from under Dr. Slaughter's desk. Mom and Carlos planning everything. Also phone records and photos. J. The revelation hit Anthony like lightning. Jeremy had been conducting his own investigation, using skills his father had never taught him, but that seemed to be genetic. During their session with Dr. Slaughter, Jeremy had somehow discovered and accessed Carlos's hidden recording device. How did you? Computer club at school teaches more than programming, Jeremy said with a slight smile. I've been watching Mom and Carlos for weeks. They're not as careful as they think. Anthony studied his son with new respect and growing concern. Jeremy had inherited not just his analytical mind, but also his willingness to take decisive action when threatened. The question was whether Anthony had created a protege or corrupted an innocent. Jeremy, what you've done is incredibly dangerous. If Carlos discovers, he won't. I was careful, and I made copies of everything before I returned his equipment. The courtroom doors opened, and Margaret emerged, her confident expression suggesting she believed victory was assured. She spotted Anthony and Jeremy talking and frowned, perhaps sensing that something had shifted. Time to go back in, Bradley Ward said, appearing at Anthony's elbow. Judge Haley is ready to render his decision. Anthony pocketed the envelope and followed his attorney back into the courtroom, acutely aware that he was about to deploy nuclear weapons in what should have been a custody proceeding. Judge Haley retook the bench, his hands visibly shaking as he prepared to read the predetermined ruling that Carlos had purchased with protection services and debt payments. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, Judge Haley began, "This court finds that the best interests of the children require." "Your Honor," Anthony interrupted, standing with military precision, "I respectfully request permission to present new evidence that directly contradicts Dr. Slaughter's testimony." The courtroom fell silent. Margaret shot a panicked glance toward the gallery where Dr. Slaughter sat, her face now pale with worry. "Mr. Huffman," Judge Haley said nervously, "all evidence was to be submitted prior to. This evidence only became available during today's proceedings, Your Honor. I believe the court has an obligation to consider information that directly bears on the welfare of my children." Anthony's tone carried the quiet authority of a man who'd commanded respect in war zones. Judge Haley, already drowning in corruption and debt, seemed to shrink behind the bench. "What type of evidence?" Anthony nodded to Bradley Ward, who produced a laptop and approached the bench. Audio recordings demonstrating that Dr. Slaughter's evaluation was not only fabricated, but was part of a criminal conspiracy to suborn perjury and obstruct justice. The words hit the courtroom like grenades. Margaret gripped her attorney's arm, while Dr. Slaughter began to rise from her seat as if to flee. "Your Honor," Phyllis Solis objected desperately, "this is highly irregular." "The irregularity," Anthony said coldly, "is allowing fabricated evidence to determine child custody. I suggest the court hear what Dr. Slaughter actually said when she thought no one was listening." Judge Haley's face had gone ashen. He understood that his own corruption was about to be exposed, that the carefully constructed conspiracy was unraveling in real time. "Play the recording," he whispered. Dr. Slaughter's voice filled the courtroom through the laptop speakers. "The psychological evaluation is next week. Carlos owes me a favor, something about evidence disappearing from a domestic violence case. She'll write whatever we need." The gasps from the gallery were audible. Margaret's face drained of color as her voice followed. "Paranoid personality disorder, potential for violence, history of controlling behavior." Enough to convince Judge Haley that the children aren't safe. The recording continued, documenting the entire conspiracy in devastating detail. Carlos's voice describing his arrangement with Judge Haley, Dr. Slaughter outlining how she'd manipulate the children's testimony, Margaret calculating how much of Anthony's fortune she could claim in the divorce. When the audio ended, the courtroom remained silent except for Dr. Slaughter's quiet sobbing. Margaret stared at Anthony with a mixture of fear and rage, finally understanding that she'd underestimated not just her husband, but also her son. Judge Haley sat frozen behind a bench, knowing that his career and freedom had just evaporated. The conspiracy that was supposed to destroy Anthony had instead documented their own criminal behavior in excruciating detail. "Your Honor," Anthony said quietly, "I move for dismissal of all custody restrictions and request that this matter be referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation." The judge's voice was barely audible. "Motion granted. Court is adjourned." As the courtroom erupted in chaos, Anthony felt Jeremy slip beside him. "Dad, there's more," his son whispered. "Carlos is waiting outside. He has backup." Through the courthouse windows, Anthony could see Carlos Waters and 3 other police officers positioned around the building exits. They'd come prepared for victory, ready to arrest Anthony on fabricated charges if the custody hearing hadn't gone as planned. Margaret and her allies had underestimated more than Anthony's skills. They'd underestimated his willingness to wage total war against anyone who threatened his children. The real battle was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. Anthony exited the courthouse through a side entrance that Jeremy had scouted earlier, avoiding Carlos's surveillance net with the practiced ease of someone who'd once evaded Taliban fighters in mountain caves. The corrupt sergeant had positioned his men at the main exits, expecting Anthony to emerge confused and defeated from what should have been his legal destruction. Instead, Anthony disappeared into downtown Seattle traffic while Carlos was still waiting for a victory that would never come. 20 minutes later, Anthony sat in Franklin Gilmore's office, watching multiple security monitors that tracked Carlos's increasingly frantic movements around the courthouse. The sergeant had finally realized his prey had escaped, and his growing desperation was evident in every gesture. "He's panicking," Franklin observed, highlighting Carlos's location on a digital map. "Making calls, trying to coordinate with the other dirty cops in his network." "Good," Anthony replied coldly. "Panicked men make mistakes." Spencer Stewart entered the office carrying a tactical bag that Anthony recognized from their Afghanistan days. Behind him followed Doug Bowers and Morris Carpenter, their faces carrying the same grim determination that had once made them an unstoppable unit. "Sit rep?" Spencer asked, using the military shorthand that came naturally after years of combat operations. Anthony briefed them on the courtroom revelation and Carlos's current position. "The immediate threat is to Jeremy and Laura. Carlos knows his entire conspiracy is exposed, which makes him extremely dangerous." "What's the extraction plan?" Doug asked, already analyzing traffic patterns on his tablet. "Jeremy and Laura are at Bellevue High School until 3 p.m. Margaret will try to collect them early, probably with Carlos providing enforcement. We need to get there first." Morris unzipped his medical bag to reveal equipment that had nothing to do with treating patients. "What about the judge and the doctor?" "They're secondary targets. Right now, Carlos is the primary threat because he has a badge and a gun, and he knows his career is over." Anthony's phone buzzed with a text from Jeremy. "Mom here early. Says family emergency. Won't go with her. Need help." The trap was closing faster than anticipated. Margaret had moved to secure the children while Carlos dealt with the courthouse fallout, but Jeremy's resistance was buying crucial time. "We go now," Anthony decided. "Spencer, you and Morris create a distraction at the courthouse. Make Carlos think I'm still in the area. Doug, you're with me." The drive to Bellevue High School took 18 minutes through afternoon traffic that seemed determined to slow their progress. Anthony's mind raced through contingencies while Doug monitored police communications on a scanner. "Carlos has put out a bolo for your vehicle," Doug reported. "He's claiming you threatened him in the courthouse." "Predictable," Anthony said, turning into the school parking lot. "He's trying to create legal justification for whatever he's planning to do next." They found Jeremy and Laura waiting in the principal's office, the administrator looking uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in her school. Margaret stood beside the desk with barely controlled fury, while Carlos waited in the hallway like a predator preparing to strike. "Mr. Huffman," the principal said nervously, "your wife says there's been a family emergency and she needs to take the children immediately." "There's no emergency," Anthony replied calmly, studying Carlos through the office windows. My wife is attempting to violate a custody arrangement during an ongoing legal proceeding. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Anthony, you don't understand what you're dealing with. Carlos has connections, resources. I understand perfectly, Anthony interrupted, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made even the principal step back. Your boyfriend is a corrupt police officer who fabricated evidence to steal my children. The only emergency here is the one he's created for himself. Carlos chose that moment to enter the office, his hand resting conspicuously on his service weapon. Mr. Huffman, I need you to come with me for questioning regarding threats made in federal court. The lie was smoothly delivered, but Anthony noted the perspiration on Carlos's forehead and the slight tremor in his voice. The sergeant was improvising badly, trying to salvage a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. I'll need to see a warrant, Doug said, stepping forward with credentials that identified him as a federal investigator. This appears to be a local family matter outside your jurisdiction. Carlos's eyes narrowed as he processed this unexpected complication. He'd expected to intimidate a businessman, not confront someone who obviously shared Anthony's professional background. Children, Anthony said quietly, go wait with Mr. Bowers in the hallway. Jeremy and Laura obeyed immediately, sensing the dangerous undercurrents flowing between the adults. As they left, Anthony noticed Jeremy palming something from the principal's desk, probably another recording device, though Anthony couldn't be sure. Margaret, Anthony continued once the children were gone, you have one chance to walk away from this. Take it. I'm not going anywhere, she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Carlos, arrest him. On what charges? Doug interjected. Exposing your criminal conspiracy? Carlos's hand moved closer to his weapon, and Anthony recognized the moment when words would give way to violence. In Afghanistan, he learned to read the precise instant when diplomacy failed and survival required different skills. Sergeant Waters, Anthony said softly, you should know that everything you've said and done in this room has been recorded and transmitted to federal authorities. Your conspiracy with Judge Haley and Dr. Slaughter is already under investigation. It was a bluff, but delivered with such confidence that Carlos hesitated. In that moment of uncertainty, Anthony struck. The movement was too fast for civilian eyes to follow. One moment Carlos was reaching for his gun. The next he was on the floor with Anthony's knee on his chest and his weapon secured in Doug's hands. Principal Williams, Anthony said calmly, as if subduing armed police officers was routine, I suggest you call 911 and report an attempted kidnapping by a suspended police officer. Suspended? Margaret gasped. As of 1 hour ago, Doug confirmed, checking his phone. Internal affairs moved faster than expected once they heard the recordings. Carlos struggled beneath Anthony's weight, his face red with exertion and humiliation. You have no idea what you've started. I have friends, connections. Anthony corrected. Your friends are currently being arrested by the FBI task force that's been investigating police corruption in King County. Your connections are being severed one by one. The principal had already called 911, her voice shaking as she reported the situation. Margaret stood frozen, finally understanding that her carefully planned coup had become a catastrophic defeat. Anthony, she whispered, we can work this out. The children need both parents. The children need protection from their mother, Anthony replied, standing as legitimate police officers entered the building. You chose Carlos over your family, Margaret. Live with the consequences. As Carlos was led away in handcuffs, Margaret made one final desperate attempt to assert her maternal rights. But the arriving officers had already been briefed on the situation by Doug's federal contacts, and Margaret found herself facing questions about her role in the conspiracy rather than being treated as a concerned mother. Jeremy and Laura watched the proceedings with wide eyes, finally understanding the full scope of their mother's betrayal. Anthony knelt beside them, his expression gentle despite the violence they'd witnessed. Are you both okay? Laura nodded silently, while Jeremy met his father's gaze with newfound respect. What happens now? Now we go home, Anthony said simply, and we start rebuilding our family. But as they left the school, Anthony knew the war was far from over. Margaret and Carlos had been defeated, but corruption networks didn't collapse overnight. There would be other battles, other enemies who needed to learn the price of threatening Anthony Huffman's children. He'd promised Jeremy that good people sometimes had to make hard choices. The hardest choice was still ahead. Chapter 6. The Network Unravels. The federal task force moved with surgical precision through Seattle's law enforcement community, guided by the evidence Jeremy had unknowingly provided and the intelligence Franklin's team had gathered. Within 72 hours of Carlos's arrest, 12 police officers, 4 judges, and 6 attorneys found themselves facing federal corruption charges. Anthony watched the news coverage from his study, noting how quickly the conspiracy network collapsed once exposed to daylight. Dr. Nina Slaughter had already pleaded guilty to fabricating psychological evaluations, desperately hoping to avoid prison time by cooperating with investigators. Judge Glenn Haley was found dead in his chambers, apparently from a heart attack brought on by the stress of facing federal prosecution and the violent collectors who held his gambling debts. Anthony felt no satisfaction in the man's death, merely the cold recognition that weak men faced predictable ends when their corruption was exposed. Margaret had been released on bail, but faced serious charges related to conspiracy and child endangerment. The society wife who'd once graced Seattle charity galas was now radioactive, shunned by former friends who feared association with the scandal. Franklin entered the study carrying a thick file. Final report on the cleanup operation. Anthony accepted the documents, noting that Franklin's team had been characteristically thorough. Every participant in the conspiracy had been identified, their crimes documented, their assets frozen pending trial. What about the children? Franklin asked. Jeremy understands more than I'd like, Anthony admitted. Laura knows her mother made bad choices, but she doesn't grasp the full scope of the betrayal yet. And Margaret? Anthony's expression hardened. Margaret ceased being my concern the moment she chose Carlos over our family. Her legal problems are her own to solve. That evening, Anthony found Jeremy in his room, apparently studying for a calculus exam, but actually monitoring encrypted communications on his laptop. The 16-year-old had developed concerning skills over the past weeks, demonstrating a natural aptitude for surveillance and intelligence gathering that reminded Anthony of his younger self. What are you working on? Jeremy closed the laptop with practiced nonchalance. Just homework. Jeremy, we need to talk about boundaries. Like the ones Mom and Carlos ignored when they tried to destroy our family. The bitter edge in his son's voice was troubling. Jeremy had been forced to grow up too quickly, exposed to adult betrayal and corruption that no teenager should witness. Your mother made terrible choices, but that doesn't mean you should abandon your moral compass. I didn't abandon anything, Jeremy replied. I protected our family using the tools available, just like you taught me. I never taught you surveillance techniques or electronic intelligence gathering. Jeremy's smile was cold beyond his years. You didn't have to. I've been watching you my whole life, Dad. I learned more from observation than most people learn from instruction. The revelation was both proud and terrifying. Anthony had tried to shield his children from the darker aspects of his nature, but Jeremy had absorbed those lessons anyway, applying them with a teenager's lack of moral restraint. Jeremy, I need you to promise me something. No more intelligence operations, no more surveillance, no more playing spy games. You're 16 years old. You should be worried about dates and college applications, not federal conspiracies. I'll think about it, Jeremy said, which wasn't the same as agreement. Anthony left his son's room with growing concern. In destroying Margaret and Carlos's conspiracy, he'd inadvertently created something potentially more dangerous. A protege who shared his skills but lacked the hard-earned wisdom that came from understanding the true cost of violence. Downstairs, Laura was curled up on the living room couch, reading one of her fantasy novels while trying to pretend everything was normal. At 14, she'd inherited her mother's artistic sensitivity, but also Anthony's stubborn strength. The combination made her resilient, but also vulnerable to the emotional trauma of watching her family disintegrate. How are you doing, sweetheart? I miss her, Laura admitted quietly. Even though I know what she did was wrong, she's still my mom. The simple honesty cut deeper than any of Margaret's betrayals. Laura was grieving the loss of the mother she'd thought she knew, struggling to reconcile the woman who'd read bedtime stories with the one who tried to steal her father's custody rights. "It's okay to miss her," Anthony said, sitting beside his daughter. "Love doesn't disappear just because someone disappoints us. Do you still love her?" The question hung in the air like a landmine. Anthony considered his answer carefully, knowing that Laura would remember his words for the rest of her life. "I love the woman I thought I married," he said finally. "But that person may never have existed. The woman I actually married chose to betray our family for money and a relationship with a criminal. That's not love, Laura. That's selfishness." Laura processed this with the serious consideration she brought to all important topics. "What happens to us now?" "We rebuild," Anthony said simply. "We learn to trust again, slowly and carefully. We create new traditions and make new memories. We prove that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice and commitment and protecting the people you love, even if it means doing bad things." The question revealed how much Laura had understood about recent events. Despite Anthony's efforts to shield her, she'd grasped that her father's methods hadn't always been legal or conventional. Sometimes, Anthony admitted, but only as a last resort, and only to protect innocent people from those who would hurt them. Like Mom and Carlos. "Yes," Laura nodded solemnly, accepting truths that no 14-year-old should have to process. "Will you teach me to protect myself? When you're older, if you still want to learn." "I want to learn now," Laura said with quiet determination. "I never want to be helpless again." Anthony studied his daughter's face, seeing not the dreamy artist she'd always been, but someone harder, more focused. Margaret's betrayal had changed them all, forcing innocence to give way to pragmatic understanding of how cruel the world could be. "We'll start with self-defense classes," he decided. "Basic awareness, personal safety, situational assessment. The other skills we'll discuss when you're 18. Promise?" "I promise." As Anthony tucked Laura into bed, he reflected on how completely Margaret's betrayal had transformed their family. She'd wanted to steal his children and his fortune, but instead she'd created something far more dangerous. A family bound together by shared trauma and united by absolute loyalty to each other. Jeremy had already demonstrated his willingness to wage war against anyone who threatened their unity. Laura was developing the same protective instincts, though tempered by her gentler nature. Anthony had tried to shield them from his darker capabilities, but circumstances had forced him to reveal the full scope of what he'd do to protect them. Margaret had gotten her divorce, but she'd also gotten something she never anticipated: enemies who would never forgive and never forget. The custody battle was over. Anthony had won decisively, claiming not just his children, but also their absolute devotion. Jeremy and Laura now understood that their father would literally kill to protect them, and that knowledge would shape every relationship they formed for the rest of their lives. Margaret had created monsters in her quest for money and freedom. Soon, she'd discover exactly what those monsters were capable of when truly threatened. Chapter 7. The Judgment Day. 6 months after the courthouse revelations, Anthony stood in his office overlooking Seattle's Elliott Bay, reading the final legal documents that would formally end his marriage to Margaret. The divorce proceedings had been remarkably swift once her criminal charges eliminated any possibility of alimony or shared custody. Margaret had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud, though she'd been released pending appeal. Her lawyer, Phyllis Solis, had been disbarred and faced her own criminal charges for knowingly presenting fabricated evidence. Carlos Waters had received 8 years for corruption, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. His police pension had been revoked, his assets seized to pay restitution to his victims. He'd be middle-aged and unemployable when he finally emerged from federal prison. Dr. Nina Slaughter had received 5 years for her role in fabricating psychological evaluations, her medical license permanently revoked. The once respected child psychologist would never again have the opportunity to manipulate vulnerable families. Justice, Anthony reflected, had been served with mathematical precision. Franklin Gilmore knocked and entered, carrying an envelope marked with familiar encryption codes. Final intelligence report on the Margaret situation. Anthony accepted the documents, noting they were significantly thicker than expected. Complications? More like revelations, Franklin said grimly. We dug deeper into her background, following money trails and communication patterns. Anthony, she's been planning this for over 2 years. The file contained financial records showing Margaret had been systematically transferring money to hidden accounts, preparing for the divorce long before she'd announced her intentions. More disturbing were the communication logs showing she'd been in contact with Carlos Waters for nearly 3 years. There's more, Franklin continued. DNA analysis confirms Laura isn't your biological daughter, but the timeline suggests Margaret knew this from the beginning. She's been lying about paternity for 14 years. Anthony absorbed this information with the cold calculation he developed during years of processing battlefield intelligence. Margaret's betrayal hadn't been impulsive. It had been systematic, methodical, and utterly ruthless. Jeremy's definitely mine? Yes. But Anthony, there's something else. Margaret's been in contact with someone while awaiting sentencing. Someone with serious resources and a grudge against you. The final section of the file contained surveillance photos of Margaret meeting with a man Anthony recognized from his military days, Viktor Kozlov, a Russian arms dealer who'd lost substantial money when Anthony had disrupted his operations in Afghanistan. She's planning something, Franklin concluded. The question is what? Anthony studied the photographs, noting the expensive restaurant, the careful positioning to avoid security cameras, the way Kozlov's bodyguards maintained perimeter security. This wasn't a casual meeting between old acquaintances. Put the children under surveillance, Anthony decided. Full coverage, 24 hours. If Margaret wants to escalate this beyond divorce court, she'll discover I can escalate further than she imagines. That evening, Anthony gathered Jeremy and Laura in his study for a conversation he'd hoped to avoid. Both children had matured significantly over the past months, developing the careful awareness that came from understanding their family was under constant threat. We need to discuss your mother's recent activities, Anthony began, noting how Jeremy immediately tensed while Laura's expression became guarded. She's been contacting dangerous people, trying to find ways to hurt our family. I need you both to understand that the situation may become more serious than anything we've faced so far. How serious? Jeremy asked, his voice carrying the clinical detachment he'd developed when discussing threats. Potentially life-threatening. Laura gripped her father's hand. What do? We follow protocols, Anthony replied, using the military terminology that had become natural in their household. Enhanced security, modified routines, constant communication. And if something happens to me, you follow the emergency procedures we've practiced. Jeremy nodded understanding, but Laura looked stricken. Dad, you're scaring me. Good, Anthony said gently. Fear keeps you alive when people are trying to hurt you. Your mother has made choices that put us all in danger, and we need to be prepared for consequences. What kind of consequences? Jeremy pressed. Anthony considered how much truth his children could handle. Jeremy was already demonstrating capabilities that concerned him, while Laura was developing survival instincts that would serve her well, but at the cost of her innocence. Your mother is working with someone who blames me for destroying his criminal organization. He's the type of man who believes in collective punishment, hurting families to make political points. So we heard him first, Jeremy said with casual brutality that chilled Anthony. No, Anthony replied firmly. We protect ourselves and let law enforcement handle criminal threats. Jeremy's expression suggested disagreement, but he remained silent. Anthony made a mental note to monitor his son more carefully. The teenager was developing a taste for preemptive violence that needed to be controlled before it became uncontrollable. Dad, Laura said quietly, if something happens to you, what happens to us? Franklin will take care of you until you're adults. You'll have full access to my resources, complete protection, and the training necessary to defend yourselves. Training? Laura asked. The kind your mother's actions have made necessary. Anthony pulled out 2 encrypted phones, handing one to each child. Emergency protocols are programmed in. If anything seems wrong, anything at all, you use these immediately. That night, as Anthony reviewed security reports and contingency plans, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since Margaret's betrayal. He'd built a successful business, raised 2 children, and tried to leave his military skills behind. But Margaret's greed and vindictiveness had forced him to resurrect capabilities he'd hoped never to use again. She transformed their divorce from a legal proceeding into a war, and wars had consequences that extended far beyond the original battlefield. At 2:47 a.m., Anthony's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Package delivery scheduled for tomorrow. Return address, Moscow. The message came from one of Franklin's surveillance teams monitoring international communications. Viktor Kozlov was moving assets into Seattle, preparing for an operation that would target Anthony's family as payment for old debts. Margaret had gotten her divorce and her freedom. Now she discovered the price of allying herself with international criminals against the father of her children. Anthony dressed quietly and slipped out of the house, leaving behind the businessman who'd tried to build a peaceful life. By the time he returned, Viktor Kozlov would understand why disrupting Anthony Huffman's family had been a fatal mistake. The war Margaret had started was about to end, but not in the way she'd planned. Chapter 8: Blood and Betrayal. The abandoned warehouse in Georgetown had been used for drug distribution until Franklin's team cleared it with methods that ensured no police reports would be filed. Now it served as an interrogation facility where Viktor Kozlov's advance team was learning the price of threatening Anthony Huffman's children. Anthony entered the warehouse at dawn, carrying the tactical gear he'd hoped never to use again. Spencer Stewart and Morris Carpenter flanked him, their faces carrying the grim professionalism that had made them effective in Afghanistan's most dangerous operations. 3 of Kozlov's men hung from chains in the center of the warehouse, their faces bearing the methodical damage that Morris applied when extracting information. They'd arrived in Seattle expecting to kidnap Laura and Jeremy as leverage against their father, but instead had walked into a trap that Franklin's surveillance network had prepared. "What have they told you?" Anthony asked Morris, noting the professional precision of the interrogation. "Kozlov's personal involvement is revenge, but Margaret promised him access to your client files," Morris reported. "Apparently your security consulting business has information he wants about several government contracts." Anthony studied the captured men, recognizing the type of criminal who worked for international arms dealers. They were competent, but not exceptional, certainly not skilled enough to threaten his family without significant support. "Where's Kozlov?" "Safe house in Bellevue. 12-man security team, planning to grab the kids during school transport," Spencer reported. Margaret provided detailed intelligence on their routines, security protocols, everything. The scope of Margaret's betrayal continued to expand. She hadn't just allied herself with Kozlov for revenge. She'd sold detailed information about their children's vulnerabilities to international criminals. What about Margaret? Staying at the Fairmont Olympic penthouse suite, planning to leave the country once Kozlov has what he wants. Anthony absorbed this information with cold fury. Margaret had not only betrayed their marriage and their children, but had also committed treason by selling classified information to foreign criminals. The woman he'd once loved had become something that transcended mere enemy. She'd become a legitimate target. "Spencer, take your team and neutralize Kozlov's operation. Morris, coordinate with Franklin on cleanup. I'm handling Margaret personally." The drive to downtown Seattle gave Anthony time to plan his approach. Margaret would be expecting him, probably had security provided by Kozlov's organization. But she'd underestimated how thoroughly Anthony's military skills had been honed by years of hunting sophisticated enemies in hostile territory. The Fairmont Olympics penthouse suite occupied the top floor, accessible only by private elevator or emergency stairwell. Margaret had chosen the location for its security advantages, not realizing those same features would trap her when Anthony came calling. Anthony entered through the hotel's service areas, using maintenance corridors he'd mapped during his initial reconnaissance. The security team Margaret expected him to confront was positioned in the lobby and main elevators, leaving the service routes vulnerable to someone with his specialized training. He reached the penthouse level through ventilation shafts, emerging in a utility closet that connected to the suite's kitchen. The luxury apartment was quiet except for the sound of Margaret's voice drifting from the living room. "Told you Anthony was dangerous, but you didn't listen," she was saying into her phone. "He's already destroyed your advance team and probably knows exactly where you are." Anthony moved silently through the kitchen, noting the expensive furnishings Margaret had purchased with money stolen from their children's futures. She'd traded their family's security for luxury she'd never earned. "No, I'm not overreacting," Margaret continued. "You don't understand what he's capable of when." Anthony stepped into the living room, his Sig Sauer P226 trained on Margaret's chest. She dropped the phone, her face cycling through surprise, fear, and finally resignation. "Hello, Margaret." "Anthony, I wondered when you'd come." She was still beautiful at 38, still carried herself with the confidence that had attracted him 15 years ago. But her eyes held a calculation he'd never seen before, the cold assessment of someone who'd learned to view relationships as transactions. "Where are Jeremy and Laura?" "Safe," Anthony replied. "Unlike you." Margaret gestured toward the phone she dropped. "Victor's probably dead by now, isn't he?" "Most likely. And his men, also dead." Margaret absorbed this information with surprising calm. "I suppose I should have expected that. You always were thorough." "You sold information about our children to international criminals," Anthony said quietly. "Information that would have gotten them killed." "I needed leverage," Margaret replied without apparent remorse. "You destroyed my relationship with Carlos, my financial security, my social position. What was I supposed to do? Accept responsibility for your choices instead of escalating into treason?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Responsibility? From a man who spent the last 6 months systematically destroying everyone who opposed him. I destroyed criminals who threatened my family. You became one of those criminals. I was desperate." "You were greedy," Anthony corrected. "Everything you've done has been motivated by money and revenge, not love for our children." Margaret's composure finally cracked. "Those aren't even your children. Laura is Carlos's daughter, and Jeremy is a sociopath who learned everything from watching you." The accusation hung in the air between them. Anthony had known about Laura's paternity for months, but hearing Margaret weaponize that knowledge confirmed how completely she'd abandoned any maternal instincts. "Jeremy is my son in every way that matters," Anthony said calmly. "Laura is my daughter regardless of genetics. You're the one who chose criminals over children. I chose survival over servitude," Margaret snapped. "I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life as a supporting character in your success story. So you decided to steal our children and sell classified information to arms dealers. I decided to take what was rightfully mine." Anthony studied his ex-wife's face, searching for any trace of the woman he'd once loved. But Margaret Sweeney Huffman had been replaced by someone harder, more calculating, utterly without redemption. "You could have had half of everything in a normal divorce," Anthony said. "The children, financial security, a chance to rebuild your life. Instead, you chose war. I chose to win. You chose to lose everything." Margaret's expression shifted from defiance to something approaching fear. "What are you going to do?" Anthony considered the question with careful deliberation. Margaret had committed treason, endangered their children, and allied herself with international criminals. In Afghanistan, such actions would have merited immediate execution. But killing Margaret would traumatize Jeremy and Laura, potentially destroying the family he'd fought so hard to protect. Some prices were too high to pay, even for perfect justice. "You're going to disappear," Anthony decided. "Tonight. Permanently. You'll surrender all parental rights, transfer your remaining assets to the children's trust funds, and never contact our family again." "And if I refuse?" Anthony's expression conveyed the answer without words. Margaret had allied herself with killers, stolen classified information, and endangered innocent children. The legal system had already failed to provide adequate consequences for her actions. I won't refuse, Margaret said quietly, finally understanding that her ex-husband had moved far beyond legal remedies. Good choice. Anthony watched Margaret pack her few remaining possessions, noting how completely her life had been reduced to what could fit in a single suitcase. She'd gambled everything on destroying him and had lost spectacularly. As she prepared to leave, Margaret turned back one final time. Anthony, do you think Jeremy and Laura will ever forgive me? No, Anthony replied without hesitation. And neither will I. Margaret nodded sadly and walked toward the door, finally understanding that some betrayals created consequences that lasted forever. Anthony watched her disappear into the Seattle night, knowing he'd never see her again. Margaret Sweeney Huffman was dead, not physically, but in every way that mattered to the family she'd abandoned. His phone buzzed with a message from Spencer. Kozlov neutralized. All assets secured. No survivors. The war was over. Anthony had won decisively, claiming not just victory, but the complete destruction of everyone who'd threatened his children. Now he could return home to Jeremy and Laura, who were waiting for confirmation that their family was finally safe. Chapter 9. The New Dynasty. 1 year after Margaret's disappearance, Anthony stood in his renovated home office, reviewing architectural plans for the expansion that would accommodate the specialized training facilities Jeremy and Laura had requested. The children had grown into formidable young adults, shaped by trauma into something harder and more focused than their peers. Jeremy, now 17, managed the family security systems with professional competence while maintaining perfect grades at his elite private school. His college applications listed interest in international relations and computer science. But Anthony knew his son's true education had come from watching sophisticated criminal conspiracies unravel under methodical pressure. Laura, 15, had developed into an accomplished martial artist and surveillance expert while maintaining her cover as a talented artist bound for prestigious art schools. Her paintings had grown darker and more complex, reflecting an understanding of human nature that most adults never achieved. Franklin Gilmore entered the office carrying a thick portfolio marked with federal classification stamps. Final report on the Margaret situation, he announced. Anthony accepted the documents, noting they were significantly lighter than previous intelligence files. Resolution complete, Franklin confirmed. Margaret Sweeney was found dead in a Bangkok hotel room 3 months ago. Apparent suicide, though the Thai authorities weren't particularly thorough in their investigation. Anthony absorbed this information without visible emotion. Margaret had chosen her fate when she'd allied herself with international criminals, though he'd hoped she might find some form of redemption in exile. The children? Don't know yet. That's your decision. Anthony considered how much truth Jeremy and Laura could handle. They'd both matured significantly over the past year, but losing a parent, even one who betrayed them, carried psychological consequences that required careful management. I'll tell them tonight. In the future, Anthony gestured toward the architectural plans. We build something new, something stronger. That evening, Anthony gathered Jeremy and Laura in the renovated living room, noting how both children immediately assumed defensive positions despite being in their own home. The training they'd received had become instinctive, transforming them into young people who would never again be vulnerable to the kind of predators their mother had unleashed. We need to discuss your mother, Anthony began, watching their reactions carefully. Jeremy's expression remained neutral, but Laura's grip tightened on the throwing knife she'd been practicing with. Both children had learned to prepare for bad news. She's dead, Anthony said simply. Suicide in Bangkok, 3 months ago. Laura's reaction was immediate tears, not for the mother who betrayed them, but for the woman she'd once thought she knew. Jeremy remained silent, processing the information with the analytical detachment he'd developed. Are we safe now? Laura asked through her tears. Completely, Anthony confirmed. All threats have been neutralized, all enemies eliminated. You can live normal lives if you choose. Normal? Jeremy laughed bitterly. Dad, we haven't been normal since the custody hearing. We've been trained by former military specialists, educated in surveillance and counterintelligence, and taught to view relationships as potential security threats. The observation was accurate but troubling. Anthony had tried to prepare his children for survival in a dangerous world, but they'd absorbed lessons that would make forming healthy relationships extremely difficult. You can choose different paths, Anthony said carefully. College, careers, families of your own. The skills you've learned are tools, not destinies. What if we don't want different paths? Laura asked, her tears stopping with disconcerting suddenness. What if we want to use these skills to protect other families from people like Mom and Carlos? The question revealed how completely his children had been transformed by their experiences. Laura wasn't just asking about career options. She was requesting permission to become something dangerous. The family business could be expanded, Jeremy added. Security consulting, threat assessment, protection services for families facing custody battles with corrupt systems. Anthony studied his children's faces, seeing not the innocents he'd tried to protect, but the warriors they'd become. Margaret's betrayal had cost them their childhood, but had also given them purpose and skills that could serve legitimate ends. If that's what you choose, Anthony said finally, we'll do it together. But you understand the costs, the isolation, the constant vigilance, the inability to trust easily. We already live with those costs, Jeremy pointed out. At least this way, we use them productively. And we protect other kids from going through what we experienced, Laura added. Anthony felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. His children had survived their mother's betrayal and emerged stronger, but they'd paid a price that couldn't be calculated. They would never be normal teenagers, never experience the carefree relationships that most young people took for granted. But they would also never be victims. They would never be unprepared for betrayal, never be defenseless against predators, never be destroyed by someone else's greed or vindictiveness. Then we build something new, Anthony decided. Huffman Family Security, protection services for families under threat, specialized consulting for custody battles, intervention services for corruption cases. With extreme prejudice when necessary? Jeremy asked. Anthony considered the question carefully. His son was asking for permission to use lethal force in defense of innocent families, to become the kind of person who eliminated threats that legal systems couldn't address. When necessary, Anthony confirmed, but always as a last resort, and always with absolute certainty of guilt. Jeremy and Laura exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of silent communication. They'd reached an understanding that transcended normal family dynamics. They were becoming a military unit dedicated to protecting the innocent from the kind of predators they'd survived. What about Mom's memory? Laura asked softly. Anthony considered how to honor the woman Margaret had once been, while acknowledging the monster she'd become. His children deserved truth, but they also deserved peace. We remember the good parts and learn from the bad parts, he said finally. Your mother loved you in her own way, but she made choices that put her personal desires above her children's welfare. We use that knowledge to become better people and better protectors. No forgiveness? Jeremy pressed. No forgiveness, Anthony confirmed. Some betrayals are unforgivable, especially when they endanger children. But also no hatred. Hatred clouds judgment and compromises effectiveness. Laura nodded solemnly. Cold justice. Exactly. As the evening progressed, Anthony outlined his vision for their family's future. They would build a legitimate business that provided protection services while serving as cover for more aggressive interventions when legal remedies proved inadequate. Jeremy would handle technology and intelligence gathering, utilizing skills that had already proven devastatingly effective against criminal conspiracies. Laura would manage human intelligence and psychological assessment, her artistic sensitivity providing insight into human motivations that formal training couldn't teach. Anthony would coordinate operations and handle the most dangerous interventions, using military skills he'd hoped to leave behind, but which circumstances had forced him to resurrect. What do we call ourselves? Laura asked as they finalized their plans. Anthony looked at his children, no longer children, really, but young adults forged by trauma into something harder and more focused than their peers would ever become. We call ourselves family, he said simply. Everything else is just business. That night, As Anthony reviewed security protocols and operational plans, he reflected on how completely Margaret's betrayal had transformed their lives. She'd wanted to destroy him and steal his children, but instead she created something far more dangerous. A family bound together by shared trauma and united by absolute loyalty to protecting the innocent. Jeremy and Laura would never have normal lives, but they would have meaningful ones. They would use their hard-earned skills to protect other families from the kind of predators that had nearly destroyed their own. Margaret had gotten her divorce and her freedom, but she'd also created her own replacement, children who would spend their lives undoing the damage caused by people like her. The Huffman family had been broken and rebuilt into something stronger. They would never forgive, never forget, and never again allow betrayal to threaten innocent children. Margaret's legacy would be the very thing she tried to destroy. A family that understood the true cost of loyalty and the absolute necessity of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The war was over. The dynasty had begun. Epilogue. 5 years later, Huffman Family Security had become the most respected and feared protection service on the West Coast. Their success rate was perfect because they didn't just protect clients. They eliminated threats with methodical precision that left no loose ends. Jeremy had graduated from MIT with degrees in computer science and international relations, his senior thesis on cyber warfare earning classification by federal authorities. Laura had earned early admission to Stanford's art program while maintaining her cover as a sensitive artist rather than a lethal intelligence operative. Anthony watched his children work together on their latest case, a custody battle where a judge was being bribed to award custody to an abusive father. The corrupt official would soon discover that some families fought back with resources and skills that legal systems couldn't comprehend. Margaret's betrayal had cost them their innocence, but given them purpose. They would spend their lives ensuring that other families never experienced the trauma that had forged them into weapons. In the end, Margaret had gotten exactly what she'd wanted, a divorce that freed her from the constraints of family loyalty. But she'd also gotten something she never anticipated, children who would dedicate their lives to destroying people like her. Some lessons could only be learned through betrayal. Some strengths could only be forged through trauma. Some families could only be created through surviving attempts to destroy them. The Huffman family understood all of these truths with perfect clarity, and they would never forget. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.